The breakthrough, this is what I'm calling a breakthrough in the intervention research. I went through every single intervention study the reading panel reviewed. There were dozens of them. I accessed them, I read them, gleaned stuff out, and I noticed a pattern. I said, wait a minute, how come we have some of these studies? Now, you know standard score points, right? Like 100 is like the midpoint, like on an IQ test or an achievement test. A standard deviation is 15, which is a large difference, right? So you know how standard score points work. Well, I noticed that some of them had very limited standard score point gains. That's just a few standard score point gains. Others had huge, and I'm like, what's up with this? About 80 to 90% of all intervention studies have 0 to 9 standard score point improvements, weighing more toward the lower end. Only about 10 to 20% have intervention studies have 12.5. That's the lowest in the group, by the way. That's why I have a 0.5 there. I can tell you the exact study. 25, I can tell you the highest. There were few in the 20s. Okay, this is word reading, word level reading skills, and the results in these strong studies. They did 1, 2, 3, and 4 year follow-ups. Depending on the study here. And the results from the 0 to 8, almost all of them lost what they gained. So if they gained 3 standard score points, they're back down, sometimes even lower. So in that smaller, the 0 to 9, most of the results were not maintained. So the summer of 2014, I went back through those as well as more recent ones up to, to get up to date on it. I found the pattern did not change with the more recent studies since 2000. So I subdivided it into 3 groups. One group of studies had 0 to 5 standard score points. The other had 6 to 9. So there's basically a tripart division existing in the research. And what I did, here's what they looked at in all these studies. Well, here, okay, so I call it the minimal group just for the vocabulary here. Then we have the mostly in that 2 to 4, only one I could come up with actually hit 5. 6 to 9, most were 6 or 7. One study I know of that actually had 9. And then the highly successful group, most of those are about 14 to 17 points. Basically a standard deviation of improvement. Now think about a standard deviation. You have a kid that's got an 85 on a word reading test, they're at 100. You got a kid that's got a 75, they're at a 90. Okay? So you're talking, many of these kids are getting normalized performance. The exciting part was in those 1, 2, and 4 year follow-ups, they maintained those gains. Not only that, but in one of the most famous studies, interestingly and sadly, when you think about it, that prompted RTI, tier 3 of RTI, they had 14 points gain after the study was over. They checked back 2 years later, they were up to 18. What happened? Those kids became orthographic mappers. They started reading, and they started even catching up more long after the study was over. And these kids, by the way, very severe reading disabled. They were in the bottom, on average, in the bottom 2%. There have been several reviews of research. Other people have said, let's look at all this research. You know what they look at? Age, second graders versus, say, fifth graders. Is there a difference in intervention? Social economic status, that's SES. Group size, 1-on-1 versus 1-on-3 or 1-on-4. How severe was it? Were they in the bottom 2% or were they in the bottom 20%? They looked at the length of the intervention. Was it 30 hours of intervention, 80 hours of intervention, 120 hours of intervention? They looked at all those different ones. As it turned out, in those 3 categories, those factors were spread across all 3 of them. So in other words, none of these made a difference compared to what I'm about to tell you. So those factors can't explain the outcome. So several, what we call meta-analyses, where they pool these studies statistically. All 3 categories use explicit systematic phonics, by the way. Let that sink in for a minute. So what that's saying, and all of these had top research groups. These weren't shoddy studies. These were our government grant money, going out and doing it with top research groups, very well respected, top universities, top journals. You had 0 to 25. So what that tells us is if you add phonics to the mix, you're guaranteed between 0 and 5 standard score point improvement. You hear that? You're guaranteed at least 0. Okay? So, and what have we been doing? When we heard the reading panel, what did we hear? More phonics, more phonics. Oh! And as we talked about earlier, the phonemic awareness just went out the window, it seems. All right? So, phonics is not the answer, but it's part of the answer. I told you, the letter sound proficiency, which is part of, comes as a result of phonics teaching, because of all the studies that didn't use phonics, none of them made it out of the 0 to 5 group. If you're talking about interventions, I could start naming names of programs that are out there that we've all invested money in, that with independent, thanks Heidi, with independent researchers looking at 0 to 5 if there was not some sort of significant phonic component. So phonics is necessary but not sufficient. The three core categories align with three different intervention approaches relative to orthographic mapping. So when you take this orthographic mapping, which is very well established, and you take all these intervention studies and you kind of intersect them, watch what happens. The minimal group, 0 to 5 standard score points, they all did, they did no phonemic awareness training, period, 0, zilch. They did phonics. You know, many of them did. Not all of them. I told you some didn't, and they were in this group. But all did explicit systematic phonics and reading practice. Now, the next group, 6 to 9, they did explicit systematic phonics, but they also did, in reading practice, they also did phonological awareness. But you know what? They did basic phonemic awareness. Basic phonemic awareness is developed by the average reader by the end of first grade. That's why Dibble's aim for that easy CBM. They stopped the phonemic awareness assessment at the end of first, because that's basic. So, segmentation and blending, and they got better results. Now, this is moving in the right direction, isn't it? With the highly successful group, 12 to 25 standard score, they aggressively went after and fixed the phonological awareness issue using advanced PA training. Advanced phonological awareness is say fly and change the r to r. Say bent and change the n to best. Say raise and change the z to t. Now there, you can't just spell it in your head, can you? You need an instant response. Some people say, oh, that phonological integration, isn't that tapping into your working memory? No. No. If you respond instantaneously, no working memory is involved. If you're thinking about it real hard, yeah, because you're not good at it, yeah, it's going to interfere with, working memory is going to interfere with that. They all did systematic phonics, every last one of them. They all did reading practice with connected text. So they gave the students the foundational skills for orthographic mapping. They turned these kids into good orthographic mappers.